And I've been there before where I didn't want to argue because I felt like if we didn't argue, then everything would be okay. And I wouldn't bring up things. And really, it was the starting point of me disengaging with Elisa. And I found that to be even more detrimental than actually bringing up, which I knew which was going to be argument or a disagreement. Because at least at that point in time, I could hear Elisa's point of view and we could work through that conflict cycle and get to a resolution together. I was in a place myself where I was like, well, if we never argue, then we're the perfect couple. Then I'm just disengaging from my feelings, from my emotions, from what's really going on. And that's not a healthy place to be either, because then you get disgruntled internally and then you start seeking other ways to find some passion or just excitement in your life. And that's not where you want to go.
Tony, my brother, welcome back to the Superhuman Life.
Oh, it's so great to be here, Frank.
Yeah, man. Like I told you in our little pre-conversation, episode 143, which you were on last year, where we really went deep into the 6 pillars, has really become my #1 resource for relationships, for marriages. We give it to our guys all the time. I think it's somewhere near the top 5 of all time downloaded and viewed episodes, which here we are recording episode 199. So that's a major, major accomplishment, man, Tony. So I'm super stoked to have you back here and talking about this new book that you and Elisa have, Conflict Resolution. So let's jump in, man. Let's dive right in. What is the biggest, in your experience, working with the thousands of relationships and marriages and all the work that you and Elisa had done over these years? What's the biggest mistake people are making in their relationships and in their marriages when it comes to understanding the role that conflict plays?
That they can't change. That this is how we are. This is who I am. And so because of that, we have this mentality, and I would say a lack mentality, that we can't ever be better. Like we can't actually grow when it comes around conflict. And so what ends up happening for a lot of couples, and even for Elisa and I for many years, is that like, this is just who we are. And there's nothing we can do about conflict. It's always going to be here. And we are going to just go through this cycle. And eventually we're just going to get so frustrated with one another. We're probably just not going to talk to each other anymore. And then nothing's going to really happen. There is no change. We can't control this. And the biggest thing that I would tell any couple, and I do tell couples, that you can make change once you understand what's happening in the conflict cycle.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about conflict. I'd love to define conflict, so that we're clear on the term, since we're going to be getting into the conflict cycle, and the whole book is centered around conflict resolution. What do we mean when we are using the word conflict in context of the book and everything we're going to be talking about here today?
Yeah,
is it an argument, or are there other layers to it?
Yeah, this is any of those. And I would say even from an internal place, we know when conflict arises. And I just want to go there first, because for myself, when I know that there is something even I'm thinking about, I haven't even expressed it to Elisa yet. I know that there's some conflict arising. There's some tension between Elisa and I. My heart rate starts going up. My hands start getting sweaty. And that has changed over the years, but there's this internal sort of like, oh, something's going on. Something got triggered. And then from that, we have arguments, we have disagreements. Those could be at different levels, right? We could be out at the park with hundreds of people around us. We can still have a disagreement, which could be vastly different than if we're at home by ourselves. And so that could be over doing the dishes. It could be around sex. It could be around, did we have a conversation today? I do want to make one distinction, which we do bring up at the beginning of the book, because I think this is important. There's a massive distinction between conflict and abuse. Like, I just want to make sure that people understand, like, healthy conflict, healthy disagreements in a marriage and even in a relationship, I think are going to be part of that relationship. Elisa and I still have arguments and discussions, heated discussions at 26 years into this. What we're not talking about, though, is verbal abuse, physical abuse. If these things are starting to happen, they're repeated, you're being belittled, demeaned, hit, kicked, spit on, anything of that nature, then we've moved into a place beyond conflict. We've moved into a place of abuse, and you need to get help. You need to get out. And I am also talking to my men out there. This isn't just you. possibly doing this to your spouse or to a loved one, it could be happening to you. And so you need to understand what abuse is. And if you're in an abusive relationship, you need to get help. That's not what this book is about, though.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good distinction there, and I'm glad we brought that up at the beginning. Also, love that you talked about like the conflict. Oftentimes is starting within. I know you guys have an entire chapter, centered around knowing thyself first, right? I agree, though. I think that conflict and disagreements and arguments is a key piece of a successful marriage relationship. You're not going to agree with the person that you spend your life with on all fronts. And if you do, somebody's probably not being truthful. This is something that Jordan Peterson, I think, talks a lot about, right?
Absolutely.
It's finding the person that you can argue with in a successful way. I think where I wanted to see your thoughts on at the beginning, though, was, do you think that there's a lot of men that think that they can get into a relationship in marriage that is conflict or argument free? Like, are we trying to avoid conflicts in our relationships? And is that stemming or the cause of a lot of the problems?
I think it might be. I think from a societal standpoint, we take a lot of, as men, if we get into arguments with our spouse, there's some shame, there's some guilt that goes with it. And yet I think if we don't have those disagreements, there's something else happening. Like you've disengaged. And I've been there before in my 20 years of marriage where I didn't want to argue because I felt like if we didn't argue, then everything would be okay. And I wouldn't bring up things. And really, it was the starting point of me disengaging with Elisa. And I found that to be even more detrimental than actually bringing up, which I knew which was going to be an argument or a disagreement. Because at least at that point in time, I could hear Elisa's point of view and we could work through that conflict cycle and get to a resolution together. But I was in a place myself where I was like, well, if we never argue, then we're the perfect couple. But then I'm just disengaging from my feelings, from my emotions, from what's really going on. And that's not a healthy place to be either, because then you get disgruntled internally and then you start seeking other ways to find some passion or just excitement in your life. And that's not where you want to go. You want to stay in the marriage knowing that you can learn the skill development to like do conflict better.
Yeah, no, we avoid the conflicts within our lives and we end up needing to escape, find coping mechanisms. Our men will understand that. A lot of these guys out here, a lot of the work that we do is centered around the pornography addiction, right? If we avoid the conflict with the wife, we avoid the argument, I want to get into happy wife, happy life conversation with you next here, right? If we don't engage with her because we know we're going to upset her, yet we're still internally conflicted, right? Well, we need an outlet for that. That becomes something like pornography or alcohol or gambling or any other vice, inject whatever you want there. So I'm curious your thoughts around the statement, happy wife, happy life.
I think there's some validity to it. And yet it's not just about a happy wife. It's about a happy marriage. It's about a fulfilling marriage. It's about a joyful marriage. And there are two, as we know in the Bible, says the two shall become one. Well, it's not just about her being happy or me being happy. It's the two of us coming together and living out the joy and the dreams and the visions we have for our marriage. In that, there's going to be conflict, though. There are going to be disagreements. There are going to be, I see something one way, she sees something the other way. We can still come to a place of to resolve that, to resolution, to a place of, hey, I'm willing to, you know what? That's what you want to do. I'm going to just stand beside you and go, let's do that, because I'm going to honor this marriage. I'm going to take a stance of like, we're on the same team. And I know what you're choosing to do is going to be for the best for both of us, not just for you. And through that, we're going to have joy. So do I want to make Elisa happy and joyful in my marriage? Absolutely. Does it allow us to, and myself, to experience more joy? Absolutely. But I don't think it's to the detriment of my own self, and Elisa being able to do her part so that I also am in a happy and joyful marriage.
Yeah, no, it comes down to, once again, knowing thyself, right? If we're suppressing all of our thoughts, wants, needs, desires in order to make another person happy, that's going to manifest somewhere down the road in an eruption, right? So let's get to this understanding of thyself, right? If this entire, cycle is starting with us knowing what's going on internally, what are some of the early warning signs, triggers, thoughts, feelings, emotions that guys need to be aware of? Like, hey, these things are bottling up inside of me now. I need to understand how I'm going to navigate the next steps of this conflict cycle.
I think the biggest thing for us guys is understanding your emotions. And I'm gonna share something here right now. It's something that Elise and I have talked about many a times, and she uses a lot with her marriage coaching clients. And it's called an emotion wheel. So, as you can see in the middle, those are the 6 core emotions, right? Fear, anger, disgust, sad, happy, surprise. And I think many of us men, when we get into disagreements or we get into these places of like, we're about to get into a fight or a disagreement or an argument, whatever you want to call it, we'll be in a place of either anger because it's just so societally acceptable just to get angry, right? Or we live in a place of fear. Something's going on that we're just in a lack mentality, I think a lot of those times, but we'll just use those 2 words and not really understanding that there are deeper reasons to why we're in this state. So knowing thyself first is sometimes going, okay, I can say I'm angry, but is it because I'm frustrated, which is the next level? And then is it I'm irritated? Did I just get irritated by my spouse? Or did my kids irritate me? Or was I at work? Or was I just driving down the street and I got irritated because somebody tried to almost sideswipe me? And I come into my home and Elisa all of a sudden is just on me. And for myself, I'm just like, well, I'm angry. No, I'm not angry at her. I'm irritated that the dude almost sideswiped my brand new car. So it's understanding what are the actual emotions you're feeling. And it's not just, I'm angry. No, there's something deeper. And once we understand that, we can then go, all right, is it my wife? Is it my loved one? Or did something else actually get me to this place, trigger me to this point?
So how does somebody begin to raise their awareness around some of these things, right? I agree 100%. Like too many of us get caught up in allowing our emotions to define us. If I'm experiencing anger, that means I'm an angry person. No, you're just experiencing the emotion of anger. Understand that it's probably a trigger warning sign that something, like you said, it wasn't really angry at the wife. It's like this is a byproduct of something that happened like earlier in the day. We have tools, right? And I'm deep into, self-awareness, gratitude, meditation, journaling, all these pillars, right? That we build into our program that help you in those moments to not react like, something happens. I don't want to react. I want to be able to process this in real time. So what are some effective strategies that we can begin to raise this self-awareness?
So one, you got to know the emotion though. Like, again, if we don't know the emotion, then how do we define where we're going to go from there? So for example, we have somebody in the One Family, and that's who we call our audience, the One Family. Been married 42 years, I think, at this point in time. He's from the South. He grew up in the South. He's in his late 60s, I think now, mid to late 60s. Literally, Frank, he picked up one of these wheels. And every night, he would go to bed with the wheel, and he would look up 1 or 2 or 3 of the words. Like, what's the definition here? Like, what's really going on? And it's amazing to see a man in his 60s who's willing to make the change for himself and for his wife. They're empty nesters. They don't have kids around, but they got grandkids and other stuff going on. But I found that interesting. Like the first step he took was just going like, what do these words mean? It literally, I talk to him at times because he'll put on small groups around the 6 pillars of intimacy. Him and his wife will do a small group for like, 4 to 5 couples. And we'll jump on just to thank him and say hello to everybody who's in the small group. And just his awareness and just the ability for this man, again, in his 60s, willing to step in and go, I can make a change. I can learn about my emotions first. Because then once I do that, then everything can build upon there.
What do you think is about him uniquely, right? Was there an event that triggered in his life that got him to this point where he was realizing he needed to change? Like, how does a guy get to that point where he's later on in life, maybe he's in his 40s, maybe he's not 60, maybe he's in his late 30s, early 40s. He's like, wife, we've got this kind of life that's just kind of like very, very routinistic. We wake up, we go to work, we high five each other in the hallway, like whatever. Like what's maybe specifically not with him if you don't want to share his personal story, but where can I get to the point where he's realizes, hey, I need to begin to make some of these changes?
Gosh, man, I think even for myself, it's little by little, right? It's stepping into something and going, wow, there's a new understanding of myself, where I am, my walk with Christ, my walk with my wife, and it's a little step, I think, where you go, okay, for some, it's like, I realize that there is skill development around this area of my life, specifically around marriage. I believe that there is skill development. We're not taught how to be married. We just go to the courthouse, we get, or wherever, the county clerk, we get our marriage license and we get married and we just do our thing. And there's no like, hey, well, here's a class on how you actually do marriage. So I think for some of us, it's like, we're going to grow. We're going to live the extraordinary marriage that we've always desired, but we got to step into it. I think other times, myself included, you hit the bottom. You know, when your spouse tells you that they don't love you anymore, I'm in love with you, but or it's I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore type of statement, or I don't think this is working, so maybe we should get a divorce. You know, there are statements that happen where you just get knocked to your knees a little bit and you're like, I need to change. Something needs to start shifting in my life. And for each man, I think it can be different. And we can have many of those in different ones of those throughout our lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think this gives us a really good point or good time here to maybe make not a pivot, but let's talk about the 6 pillars, right? Because what you said there is right, is like a lot of times we stop doing this stuff to make the marriage work. It's like we stop playing offense and then we reach this point where it's like we need so much defense. It's like we don't have enough defensive line to call on. And it's like now we're kind of everything's falling apart in front of our eyes, right? So
we got some big gaps in the holes, man.
Yeah, right.
That's gonna run through.
It's like we need the 350-pound defensive lineman to come in here. It's like, oh, we only got 275. It's like, oh, he's not going to work. But let's talk about, obviously, we want to point people to episode 143, where we really unpacked. We spent an entire hour talking about these 6 pillars, but let's bring them into this conversation. Let's define the 6 pillars here really quickly. And then what role do the pillars of intimacy play in conflict resolution? Because you would think like intimacy, conflict, like they don't work together.
Yep. So number 1, intimacy is closeness and connection. Intimacy is not sex. Our society has made it that. Intimacy, I can have intimacy with God. I can have intimacy with Elisa. I can have intimacy with my children, because intimacy is closeness and connection, first and foremost. And the 6 of them are emotional intimacy. We have physical intimacy, which is your non-sexual touch. You have financial intimacy, spiritual intimacy, recreational intimacy, which is your fun, your activities, dates. And then we have sexual intimacy. And so those are the 6.
What's the relationship? What role do understanding the pillars play in helping process and navigate the conflict cycle?
Yeah. So if we look at each of the 6 pillars of intimacy and we say, hey, that is our framework for our marriage. So in our first book, we talk about this a lot. Like your pillars can have cracks in them. So emotional intimacy, your communication, your verbal, nonverbal communication. Is there a crack in that pillar? Do I talk to my wife? Do I actually like have conversations with her? If I'm not, there can be a crack in that pillar, which then could create conflict, right? She wants to have a conversation, but I'm choosing not to have it with her. All of a sudden, she comes out to me and goes, we don't ever talk. No, we do talk. No, we don't. I can't remember the last time we talked. Now, all of a sudden, I'm getting defensive because I'm like, no, we just talked 5 minutes ago. No, you actually were, your face was buried in your phone and you said a few words to me. Oh, we got some cracks in that pillar. And then I can go all the way down to like sexual intimacy, where I think many of us men have been before. We get rejected. We're making an advance on our spouse. We're initiating. And she turns around and goes, no, not tonight. No, I don't want to do that. That creates that conflict. Well, aren't we going to have sexual intercourse tonight? Don't you want to have sex with me? No, not tonight. I'm not interested. And that can then, maybe not in the moment, but it can possibly in the moment, or it could happen the next day where you're just like, I'm frustrated, or 2 weeks from now, or 2 months from now, where it's just like, you keep rejecting me and we have cracks in that pillar, which then relate to that conflict.
Yeah. So zeroing in here and getting, tactical as much as we can. Obviously, we want to drive people to the book because that's where they're going to get a lot of this, a lot of these steps in those moments, right? We're realizing now there's cracks, right? Like where she rejected me, she said, we haven't talked. We talked 5 minutes ago. No, your phone was in your face was in your phone. Like whatever this scenario was, maybe it's not the perfect one that we painted there. So we've recognized now that, hey, we're entering into, I guess, a conflict situation. Walk us through these next, series of steps. What are we thinking? What are we doing? How are we kind of communicating this?
Yeah. And I'm going to just share, and I'm just looking down because within the book, Elisa created an entire workbook and a video training so people can go through this, because what she wanted to do was be able to give anybody the ability to look at, let's just go with the conversation one. Let's just do the emotional intimacy one, right? And the conflict starts. You described it as I described it. The conflict is starting. And so the next place in that cycle is escalation. So it's and here's something I wanted to say too with this conflict cycle. Time is irrelevant. We could escalate in that moment, or we could be shoving it aside, and we could almost pick this up 24 hours or 48 hours later, having not addressed it, and now we're going to escalate it. Because maybe beforehand the kiddos were around and I wasn't going to bring it up and we weren't going to get in a disagreement and an argument in front of the kids. So time is irrelevant, like within this conflict cycle. So it escalates. What does escalation look like? Well, we've all been there. Some of us start to get loud and, hey, well, you're not listening to me. Why aren't you listening? And others just freeze, shut down. They're not saying anything. Others are taking off, man. Like the escalation starts getting going. The next part is boiling point, where it's really like we are in. And each of us have our own ways of going after it, right? And I'm sure you've been here, Frank. I would be hard pressed to find somebody as we go through this who's not just sitting there thinking like, yeah, I was there yesterday, or I was there last week with somebody. Like, and again, this doesn't have to be your spouse. It could be your child. It could be your mom or your dad. It could be a coworker. We go through these things, you know? So we escalate. After the escalation, we go to a cool down phase. Again, this could be 10 minutes. It could be 10 days. And then we get to the last one, which is either you come to resolution, you resolve the issue, the problem at hand, or you go back to status quo, which is we just sort of bury it under the rug, add it to the, herd of elephants that are already in our room, and just move forward again.
So there will be a case in scenarios where conflict arises and the actual solution is not resolving it. It's brushing it under the rug?
Because we're in a cycle. So not every conflict has resolution. We can choose to have resolution, but many a times we may not want to resolve it. We like just getting into this same conflict cycle. I know, like, here's an example. I know, and this is years and years ago. This isn't now in my marriage. But I could say something to Elisa. She would say something back. I would say something to her. We would start escalating of that argument, of that conversation. We'd get to a place of boiling point. We'd cool down, but we never would resolve it. And guess what? It would happen a month later. We'd be in the same place, the same time frame, the same thing happens, and we just go around and around and around. So what we want to do is we want to get to resolution because we want to stop that conflict cycle. But we have to make a choice to say, it's time to stop this cycle. It's just like if I'm drinking and I'm an alcoholic and I know I need to stop it, but I keep going to it. I need an interruption. I need an intervention. I need to get help. And some folks, even within conflict, they don't want to resolve it. It's just, we're going to just push it aside, go back to status quo, and it may come up again, may come up in a couple of days, it may come up in a couple of months.
Well, I guess that's where I see the danger in this, right? Is I think with you and Alicia, you guys are both hyper self-aware, right? You guys have been doing this work both individually and on yourself and on your marriage, and you guys have worked with thousands of people. So you guys are equipped to understand, like, know thyself first. It's like you've probably mastered chapter 2. But there's a lot of people that don't have that level of self-awareness. And a lot of this conflict, from my experience, my understanding of trauma, right, is driven by kind of subconscious behaviors, right? Like they need some disruption in their life. Like they need chaos. So I've been in never been in marriages like this because I've never been married, but I've been in relationships with women. It's like they need conflict. They need arguments, like, because there's issues from their past that haven't been resolved. So I could see an issue where it's like you're not resolving it. You're just setting this person up to have another traumatic experience again.
So we brought awareness to it. I'm not saying this book is going to solve all your deep, dark trauma that you've experienced in your life. What I am saying is that we have brought awareness to this. And now it is time for you, if that is where you're at, then go get help.
Got it. Got it. And that's why the
Go get
second
and go
chapter is
address it.
knowing thyself. Like you need to know yourself. You need to know your past. You need to know if you have issues from the past that are causing you to just constantly, like, you can't have things going well. Like, you may know people like this, right? Things can't be going well in their life. They need to disrupt it. And this is always due to some type of subconscious, unconscious programming from their past. So we don't need to stay here a lot because I'm sure I could spend the rest of the day.
I love you bringing that up, because one of the areas that I think gets brought up from my standpoint when I hear this is around sexual intimacy, and especially sexual trauma, when somebody was either molested or sexually abused as a young child, and now in their marriage, their conflict arises when it could be the husband or the wife, depending on who was molested or sexually abused, is like they're being pursued and they're now rejecting their spouse. And so what they'll do is they'll come to us and go, well, we can't have a marriage like yours, or we can't have the sexual intimacy pillar strengthened like yours. And I go, have you addressed that? Have you gotten help? Have you gone to a therapist? Have you worked through that? No, because I just don't want to deal with it. It's exactly what you said. It's going to just keep on going until you interrupt it. And what we're trying to do when we look at conflict is start to bring this stuff up so that people can get healthy. Like, can the book do a lot for you? Absolutely. But there can be some deep, dark hurts, and it doesn't even have to be sexual. It can be stuff that your parents said to you time and time and time again. They told you were stupid. They told you were ugly. They told you were worthless. They told you you were a loser. Man, they told you this stuff. But you're sitting in your muck, and every time your spouse says something to you, you go off the handle, but you haven't addressed that. You don't know yourself first, so go get help. Go work with Frank if you're dealing with your stuff, man. Like, if he can help you in those areas, like, get that stuff resolved, because if you don't, you're going to sit in a dark place for a long time.
You even said it, right? It's like the book is obviously the secret to breaking the conflict cycle in your marriage. You and, Elisa are marriage experts, but intimacy is closeness and connection. So it is a part of every relationship that we have. So I want to maybe talk about, the single guys, but you may have experienced this, maybe not in your past, but people, right, that experience issues with avoiding conflict at work, right? It's like they become a pushover or a people pleaser. It's like knowing every office has that person, right? Just go ask Bob. Just go ask Bob. Bob's going to do it. Bob's not going to push back at all. And this person is avoiding conflict due to whatever reason. So let's talk about the role that understanding these 6 pillars in this book can play in a life outside of a marriage.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, people pleaser. So there's 4 types of people or 4 types of reactions you have when conflict arises. One of them is fawning, and fawning is that sort of, okay, everything, like, I'm going to make everything okay. Like, I'm not going to get into this. There's the fighter, like, I'm going to get up in your face. Like, we're going to go after this. Yeah, that's me too. Grew up Italian. Like, we're going to go after this. We're going to get done. There's the freeze, the person who freezes. They just stop. They shut down. That's Elisa. And then you have your flight. Those are the people who are going to take off. Like, they're like, and there's probably one dominant one you are, and there's probably a secondary. Like, hey, I'm a fight, but I'm also sort of like a fawner, because I'll fight, but I also want to make everybody happy.
Yeah, I'm gonna beat you up a little bit, and then I'm gonna rub you and tell you it's gonna be okay. Like we're gonna get on the other side of this thing.
Exactly.
Punch you in the face and then put a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring those up because I think in any type of relationship, be it a work relationship, a parent relationship, even a child to your parents, you can see these things happening. And we now have the knowledge and understanding as you read the book of who I am and how do I want to address folks. Like my mom, if I were to say who my mom is, she would be most likely a freeze. Like, we'll bring stuff up and she'll just get quiet. She's almost like Elisa. But she'll just get quiet. But she's also sort of that fawn, because she doesn't want anybody to be upset. She wants everybody to get along. And so it's like, okay, how do I navigate a disagreement with my mom? Like, and those are tough situations, right? Because it's a different relationship. Like, I can be at my mom's house, Frank. She lives about an hour and a half away from me, 2 hours, depending on traffic here in Southern California. But if mom and I get in an argument, she knows I love her. I know she loves me, but I can leave her house. Like, I can drive back home and we'll deal with it. Like, and so we always have to look at the relationship and how that works. And I just want to share when it comes to parents. Um, I've been in arguments with my mom. Um, Most recently, a few years ago, we had, um, I was attacked by my brother verbally via social media. And I was very upset with that. And I took it out on my mom. And so having to work through that conflict cycle took some time. It wasn't just done. I was very mad. I went right into my fight mode. Conflict. It was like it was escalation. It didn't even just start. It was escalation, boiling point. The cool down period took place when I finally just got off the phone. And I think we're still sort of in that resolution phase. I've talked to her many a times over in the last 3 years about it. Um, and I think we're both in a better spot. But don't forget, within conflict and when words get thrown around and things get said, there's also trust that gets broken, and so that has to be rebuilt on my side, um, and taking responsibility for my actions and the way I treated her in that moment. So, um, some of these things that, like I said, there is no time limit on these things. It could get done like that, but mom and I are still working through some stuff. You know.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that and getting vulnerable, Tony. Reminds me of the last conversation. You shared that powerful story with your father. One thing I really love is just your openness. I think you're creating intimacy with the audience right now through that closeness and connection, inviting them into your world. So I really appreciate that. I want to acknowledge you there, Tony, for that. Let's talk about maybe the single guys or the guys that are in the dating stages. I know you and Elisa do a lot of work with young adults in your church, and it's a lot of the work that I do as well. Probably half of the audience listening to this right now is going to be young single men. It's kind of the stage that I'm in, right? It's like I'm navigating kind of the dating space as a almost 40-year-old man. It's an interesting world out there, Tony. But it's like I want to see as early on as possible for me in dating somebody, how do they handle conflict? I may not, bring it up like on a date, but it's like as we're kind of navigating certain things, like I'm kind of sitting back, almost assessing how do they kind of navigate some of these things, like figuring out like, are they fond or are they freezing? Are they going to run away? Like I was dating somebody towards the end of last year. Immediate first sign of conflict, like she pulls away and it's like that was the end of like a 2-month relationship because we had one disagreement. Okay, big warning sign. I've learned a lot from that. So talk to the single young men out there, the guys that are kind of navigating the dating space and why we need to understand some of these things and what role this book can play for them.
So I'm going to talk like those single guys, maybe dating, early relationships, sort of in that area. So for Elisa and I, I'm going to be 50 this year. Elisa's going to be 49. And so we run a small group here at our home for what we call our young adults at our church. So that's the 19 and 29-year-olds. So, and they're all single. We don't, if they get married, like if they're single, they start dating, then they get married, we move them on to another connect group, which is what we call them here at our church. So ours are for single folks. And I talk to a lot of guys in this. And most recently, one of the guys, single guy, and we are believing and praying for a woman to come in his life. She's an amazing gal. But they've been dating now for a few months, I think maybe 6 months at this point. But it's been interesting because they have had conflict and we have sat down with them and talking to them about it and just sharing with them with like, where are you? Where are these conflicts happening? Having to get real and honest with them that, hey, not every time she says something, you have to react to it. Not every time he says something, you have to react to it. You can process it a little bit more. But also telling them, like, if the relationship matters, you guys are going to work through this. Is it going to be perfect? No, because we're always growing. 26 years into this thing called marriage, at least, and I still have arguments. But there was one thing I remember just telling him because he texted me and then left a voice message about her and all this sort of stuff. Like, when I say this, she doesn't do this and that and that. And she's not listening to me around the conflict cycle and this. And I finally just said to him, I said, hey, man, I get it, but I'm going to just tell you straight right now, man. The only person you can change is you. So I'm hearing you. And I understand that she may be doing something that is creating that trigger in you and you know thyself now, he's understanding. I go, and yet one of the fruits of the spirits is self-control. I go, so you can control yourself in that moment, but you also have to understand what you can do. Are you like, even in conflict, I'm like, even prior to the conflict happening, are you speaking life into her? Are you telling her like that she's amazing, that you love being with her? Like, are you speaking life into her? Are you looking at yourself in the man in the mirror and going, what can I do? How can I change? And he's 23. I think he's like 23. And literally, I mean, I just did a voice message to him, Frank, and I was a little harsh. But at the same time, I'm like, and I told him, I'm like, hey, dude, I don't mean to come off this way. And yet, I don't want you to go through life. I don't want you to go, another day. I don't want you to go another year or 5 years going through stuff that I went through had somebody just been straight with me. And I'm like, dude, I get it. There are things that the two of you are having conflict around. And yet, are you looking at yourself and going, what can I do in this situation? And even prior to that situation. So it's never perfect. This is the thing too. It's like the younger generation, I'm going to say it myself. I'm about to be 50. I've seen generations now, which is wild to even think about. But you want everything to be perfect on both sides before you actually do the work together. And a marriage and in a relationship is the two shall become one. It doesn't mean the two shall be perfect when they become one. The two shall become one, and together we'll work through those things to have the extraordinary marriage we desire. So conflict is one of those areas that we're always learning. Now, if there's telltale signs from early on, by all means, I understand. But if it's one argument, two or three, and we're working and we can get to a resolution, then great. Like, let's keep moving forward.
Yeah, Tony, it reminds me of one of the biggest things that really jumped out at me from our last conversation that you shared towards the end was that the I do is the beginning. Most people think of the I do as the end, and now we're going to go live this fantasy life forever. And it's like, no, when you say I do, when you exchange those rings and you become one, like now the work starts. And it's like,
now it's beginning.
It's like we want the physique before we go to the gym. We want the bank account before we put in the work. We want the successful marriage before we actually go through, understanding the dynamics of conflict, of intimacy, of resolution, of marriage, of what actually makes another person tick. So I think you're speaking to a fundamental flaw in a lot of just people in general is we want the gratification, we want the results before we actually do the work. And I love the lesson right there on personal responsibility, right? It's like asking yourself, like, she's not responding, what am I doing that's causing this conflict within the relationship? It's all we can do is we can turn it in and of ourself, right? So this is great, Tony. This is really, really good. I want to ask.
And can I just share a little bit too?
Please.
I mean, the work you do, especially around pornography and everything, the conflict that comes up around that. And I think even internally, what happens? Like, we can even look at this just from ourselves. Like, what's happening internally that we get to this place of like, I'm going here. Like, because I had an 18-year addiction to pornography, Frank. And I think I shared that with you. And I had a miraculous healing and haven't looked at it in 20 years. But I think back to those times and I'm like, and this is well before we ever developed the conflict cycle, but I look back and I'm like, man, why was I looking at pornography for 7 years into my marriage when I had my beautiful wife, Elisa, right there? Like, why? The conflict started internally. Man, I had something set into me. I felt lonely. I felt depressed. I felt like I wasn't seen. So it escalated, right? So it escalated to this point of, well, if I'm not going to get it from my wife, then I might as well go somewhere else to substitute it. Boiling point typically, I think, would be for most guys who are looking at pornography is masturbation. We'll just call it that, right? Like, I got to that point. It like that gave me that charge. Cool down, come off of it, and then is there a resolution? Did I take a step to make a change, or is it just, again, back to that status quo? And I think this is the work you do and the amazing work you are doing to help men to realize, like, you can get rid of that. You can get out of that cycle of shame and guilt and frustration by going, I'm going to know thyself first. I'm going to look at myself and I'm going to take personal responsibility and accountability for myself and go, what can I do to change that? So I just wanted to bring that up because I do want to honor you and the work you are doing because it is a big thing. It changes lives, it changes marriages, and I know it changes generations.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Tony. And I would add, it's one more layer, right? It's not just knowing thyself; it's loving thyself. It's like wanting the better for yourself. I think a lot of the men here, it's like they love their wives, they love their girlfriends, they love their spouses, they love their friends, they love their families. They struggle with the loving of themselves because they've fallen into that state of hopelessness and meaningless, right? And that's where the addiction comes into pornography. It's never a sexual driver that's getting us there. It's, you even said it for you. It's like, I didn't feel whole and complete. I was struggling from a depression, from an isolation, from this, does Lisa even really want me? Like, so there's this lack of like, internal value within ourselves. We seek something out to make ourselves feel good, but then it creates that shame cycle, right? Because you know you shouldn't be doing it. Last couple of minutes here, Tony. I'd love to ask you about the role our faith and our relationship in Christ or with Christ plays in the conflict resolution cycle.
Let's also remember Jesus yelled at people. He was, you know what I mean? There was some conflict. If you read through the Gospels, you're going to see some conflict happening. You're going to see, you know, Jesus pretty much telling Peter, like, what the heck are you doing by cutting this man's ear off? Like, there was conflict he was even engaged in. The disciples were engaged in conflict at times. So to say that there was none or that even our Lord and Savior didn't deal with it, I think would be a lie that we're telling ourselves and that the devil wants to put in our ear to make us feel like we're less than worthy. And he died on the cross for all of our sins. And so I just look at the Gospels and I just go, he experienced conflict, but how did he do it? He did it through love. He did it through compassion. He did it by, even when he reprimanded somebody, he still resolved it by letting them know that he was there for them. You know, with Peter, if you think about Peter and all he did, maybe the resolution didn't come for a bit, but he looked at Peter and said, you no longer will be Simon Peter, but you will be Peter. You'll be the rock that I build this church on. And you look at that and you're like, if Christ can do it with all that he went through, being jeered and yelled at and whipped and kicked at and put a crown of thorns on his head in the conflict that he endured, I think as a follower of Christ, we can look at him and go, how did he treat others?
Yeah, he modeled the perfect example for us. So
of love.
Yeah.
You know, and even when, I will say this, even when Elisa and I have ours and we cool down, we resolve, there's always this moment where I'll grab her and I'll just look in her eyes and I'll say, I know we went through that. And yet I love you. I will always love you. And I will always be here for you.
Amazing.
That's it.
Yeah.
I give her a kiss and then we walk on and we go on our way. And we're like, all right, let's go. Yes. Like, we got life to live. That was a little blip in it. So let's rock and roll, baby doll.
So good. So good. Tony, tell the guys where they can find the book, what's kind of upcoming next, and we'll bring the conversation to a close with our last question here.
Yeah. So you can grab the book at conflictresolutionbook.com. If you want to learn more about Elisa and I and everything that we do, you can go to oneextraordinarymarriage.com.
Guys, and we'll get all that stuff plugged down in the show notes. Obviously, we'll link up episode 143 as well. So if you guys haven't checked that out, I definitely recommend go listening to that. It's become, like I said, our #1 resource for relationship and marriages. We'll have all of the links for Tony, the book, the website, the podcast, everything that him and his beautiful wife, Elisa, are putting out there into the world. Normally, Tony, we ask the same question to every guest. We had you on, 50th episode ago and ask you what your definition of a Superman life. So I don't want to close today's conversation with that. I want to give these guys a next step. So you literally write the next step into the book. So the guys that are listening, that are walking away from this, obviously step #1, go pick up the book. What's the next step for a guy though, hearing this today?
Be intentional and take action. That's what I always say. Be intentional. Do you want to make a change? If so, grab it, start taking the steps that are needed and take action. And do know we have to take many steps to get to that place. So that's what I would say.
And many steps, many actions. It's funny. I was on a coaching call this morning with a group of guys and sharing things that, are going to help him. And he's sitting back, he's taking notes. He's like, Frank, I know all of this. And I'm like, well, that's why we had the calls, because it's the information is only 20% of the transformation. The actual implementation or the actions, the steps that you take is what's going to produce 80%. So maybe you guys heard some similar things here today that you've already known in the past. Maybe we enlightened you with some new information. Now it's on you though to take the action. So if you want to create change, if you want to transform, if you want to create the life that you were designed to live and live your own Superman life, guys, it's going to be done in the actions that you take. So we're incredibly grateful, Tony, for coming back on us here today. It's always a pleasure, always a joy picking your brain, man. I love what you guys are doing. And guys, if you're getting value out of these conversations, you know, we're coming up on episode 200, dropping next week. We're at 199, guys. We have seen some tremendous growth, and it's all because of you. You know, we started this passion little less than 4 years ago, and I can't believe it's grown into what it is. So I want to thank every single person listening here today. And if you want to support us, you can do that in two ways. You can head over to Apple, wherever you're consuming these podcasts, and leave that 5-star rating, a written review. But more importantly, if there's a guy that's struggling, maybe in his relationships, maybe in his intimacy, maybe in his conflict resolution, and he's in your life, do us the favor and do him the blessing by sharing today's conversation. But for Tony DiLorenzo, Frank Rich, your host here, we love you guys, and we'll see you next week.